May I request Mr. Sanjay Kirloskar to open the session with his introductory remarks.
Thank you. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a Member of Parliament, Lok Sabha, and Chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, Professor Brahma Chalani, Professor of Strategic Studies, Center for Policy Research, and Fellow of the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, Dr. Claude Smadja, President, Smadja and Smadja Strategic Advisory, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's participating in this session. This session is about an important matter of recent times, the growing disorder in the world, and India's changing place and role in it. Dr. Tharoor, it is a pleasure to have you join us today on the IMA platform, and many thanks for agreeing to do this session. You're a former UN Under-Secretary General and a former Foreign Minister of India. You have seen geopolitical churns up close and have been personally involved in shaping India's global strategy and policies. You have been a proponent of using soft power to further national interest and preventing the use of hard power to persuade nations or to settle disputes. The current situation may be coming a full circle for you, since your very first book, Reason of State, was on the making of India's foreign policy. We are keen to know your prognosis of the geopolitical climax emanating from the ongoing developments, especially to the north and northwest of India. Thank you very much for joining us today, and a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you.
It's an invitation. Sorry.
Professor Chalani, it's a pleasure to have you, and many thanks for agreeing to moderate this session. You're one of India's foremost scholars and commentators on its security and foreign policy matters. You're a professor of strategic affairs at the premier think tank, Center for Policy Research. You've also done work with Harvard University, the Brookings Institution, Johns Hopkins University, and the Australian National University. You've been a part of India's Foreign Policy Advisory Group and the National Security Council. You've also written many books on strategic issues and are a regular contributor to global media on international security matters. Thank you for joining us, and a warm welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Smadja, it's a pleasure to have you on this panel. You have been a friend of IMA for a very long time and were one of our first guests in our online Leader Speak series, which we began last year. You've seen the world's political and business leaders in action at very close quarters. You led the World Economic Forum during the glory days of globalization and still advised many leaders and corporations on geo-economic matters, particularly concerning China and India. We'd like you to tell us where the world is headed on matters of territory, trade, technology, given that everyone is high on a cocktail of pride and paranoia. Thank you for joining us, and a warm welcome to you too.
Thank you so much for having me with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID period witnessed major upheavals in the geopolitical situation in the world, particularly in South Asia. And India has been forced to rethink its security situation and its strategic options. The chaotic retreat of the US-led coalition from Afghanistan, the immediate collapse of its sponsored regime, and the recapture of the country by the Taliban, these events have shocked and awed the world. Many consider it a decisive point in America's waning appetite and capacity to be the world's order keeper. With America wanting to go home, the world seems to be entering a phase of power struggle amongst the has-beens and the wannabe hegemons. Russia has been trying to regain its influence in the world. It has captured Crimea and practically split the Ukraine. It's also played a decisive role in the civil war in Syria and dictated the settlement of territory between Armenia and Azerbaijan. All this with token protests and sanctions from the US. China has been making countries in Asia, Africa, South America, and even Europe dependent and gaining influence on the world's trade routes on land and sea. And all this while, America has been preoccupied with domestic polarization over race, immigration, inequality, and climate change. Europe is beginning to show signs of recovering from the psychological damage of the Second World War, and its leaders are talking about regaining control of their trade and security policies from the US. With the US fading, there's no superpower left to broker peace or war and enforce any rules. In this vacuum, it's anybody's game, and most of the largest powers are acting on the awareness that they are on their own, and there is nobody to stop their adventures. This is the first time that modern India finds itself in a world where it has to make place for itself and find a role in international affairs all by itself. So we are very privileged to have a panel of outstanding experts on strategic affairs, and we can look forward to a very exciting discussion. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Chalani to conduct the session. Over to you, Professor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kirloskar, for that excellent introduction. You've actually made my task much easier by both introducing the two speakers and also providing an overview of the subject. So I have little to add other than to point out that the title of the session is about the emerging world order, but Afghanistan developments impinge directly on the regional order, and the regional disorder is likely to affect international peace and security because the fact that a terrorist militia now governs Afghanistan is a development that will certainly come back to haunt US and Western security. When history is written, historians will wonder how the US could hand Afghanistan to a group of medieval thugs. This terrorist militia has got not just a nation state, it has also been gifted troves of US-made weapons, helicopters, planes, and armored vehicles worth many millions of dollars, making the Taliban the first terrorist organization to acquire advanced air and land-based capabilities. So the implications of the terrorist takeover of Afghanistan for regional security, including for India's security in particular, are obvious. Let me get Shashi and Claude to weigh in on this issue. We have a very short session, only for 40 minutes. So I would request each of them to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes maximum, and then we can have an open discussion. Shashi is listed first, so may I ask Shashi to begin first?
Sure, Brahma, and since I haven't any prepared remarks, I thought I would have an exchange with you all. So it may be shorter, and if it's not, please interrupt me. My basic concern with what has happened, very simply, is that we are looking at not only a major setback, I believe, for our interests with the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, but some very serious challenges geopolitically in the region. And I'll explain that briefly and perhaps leave it to others to react. The first and most significant is, of course, our historical memory of the last time the Taliban were in power from 1996 to 2001, when the Islamic Emirate in that version was deeply and unremittingly hostile to us. At that time, we actually worked with the Iranians and the Russians to try and actually oppose them by providing arms and resources to Ahmad Shah Massoud's rebellion in the Panjshir Valley. But at the end, it was the American assaults in 2001 that finally cleared the way out of the Taliban government's removal. While they were there, we also witnessed the Kandahar hijacking, on which Indian civilians were actually killed on the tarmac of that airport and their bodies flung to that tarmac. And as we all know, we had to hand over half a dozen or 5 terrorists from Indian jails who went on to do terrible things. One of them was Maulana Masood Azhar, who was responsible in part for what happened on 26/11. Another was the gentleman who was responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Daniel Pearl. So historical memory, shall we say, is not particularly pleasant. And so far, the Taliban, despite some press statements to the contrary, have not shown much reason to believe they're going to be very different in Taliban 2.0. That is, that there was a time when, in the very first few days after the fall of Kabul, when we heard there would be an amnesty for all those who sided with the previous regime, when we were told that women will be able to continue to work. A woman newscaster even interviewed the principal Taliban spokesman and so on. But in the few weeks since then, in roughly a month since the fall of Kabul, we have seen not only that there was no amnesty, but that even the relatives of people who worked for the previous regime and for the Americans have been executed by the Taliban. We've seen copies of death sentences issued for the mere sin of being the brother of somebody who worked for the US Embassy. The very newscaster who conducted that interview, the female newscaster, has fled the country saying it is impossible for women to work. Women have been stopped from going to government offices, have been told that all the old restrictions about their being alone in private on the streets and so on are back. On top of that, as we know, the Ministry for Women's Rights has been replaced by the dreaded old Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, which means that women's rights are back to exactly where they were 25 years ago. So in these circumstances, should India even hope that there is much to be gained from direct dialogue and cooperation with the Taliban? Well, we have invested $3 billion of our taxpayers' money into Afghanistan. We've done so for all sorts of rather lasting and valuable assets, ranging from the Zaranj-Dalaram highway, which cuts across the southwest Afghanistan, the Afghan parliament, the Salma Dam, the very fact that Kabul has 24/7 electricity from Pune-Charkhi to Kabul is because our people strung up the wires that made it possible to bring hydroelectricity from the mountains. All of these things have been done by us, plus large numbers of girls' schools, women's hospitals, and so on, all of which, of course, are now assets for the Taliban. So one might like to think that we want to continue, having made that investment, we want to continue being involved. But the question is, what kind of reception would we get if we wish to be? And I personally don't think it was a wrong decision to pull the Indian ambassador and his staff out immediately as soon as we were able to do so. On the other hand, the larger ominous regional implications are the likely emergence of a China-Pakistan-Afghanistan axis. Last time around, China was relatively neutral, even slightly wary about the Taliban because of the supposed influence of Taliban extremism on the Uyghurs of so-called Eastern Turkestan, that is the Xinjiang province. Today, China is actively talking to the Taliban. There's direct reference to the possibility of exploiting mineral deposits. It seems that for some months before the Taliban won, the Chinese were already telling them that, look, we've put $90 billion into Pakistan. The largest single project in the Belt and Road Initiative is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. We put all our money in there. We don't want you to do anything that will jeopardize that investment. At the same time, we'll make it worth your while because we'll come in and pour a few billion into your country in exchange for being allowed to exploit the mineral resources. And the Taliban, after all, have inherited a country whose government budget, as recently as the most recent government budget, was 80% financed by foreign assistance. And since the principal source of that assistance was the United States and the West, and they have now pulled out, I'm sure the Taliban would look with a great deal of interest for Chinese money. So China coming in, Pakistan, of course, is already very much enthralled to China. And now the Afghans apparently are in place as well. The axis is going to be a genuine reality on our northwestern border. Allied to that is the problem that the last time around, Iran was directly working with us against the Taliban, especially after the killing of 11 Iranian diplomats in Mazar-e-Sharif. And the Russians were decidedly sympathetic to the Indian point of view on the Taliban and quite hostile to the Taliban themselves. Today, in 2021, neither is really true in the same way. The Russians are now essentially fellow travelers of the Chinese. They are far more likely to be attentive to Chinese interests than Indian in their present avatar. The statements made by their special envoy with the amazing name of Kabulov have been particularly contemptuous of New Delhi's interests and of India's role in Afghanistan. I don't really look to Russia now with a great deal of hope. And as for Iran, they now have a new hardline government in Tehran, which may have a great deal much more sympathy for the kindred spirits ruling in Kabul than the previous government did, provided, of course, that the Taliban is different in one important way from the last time around. That is, they do not actively persecute Afghanistan's Shia minority. The Iranians have an interest in the well-being of the Hazaras, the Tajiks, and the Uzbeks. And if it turns out that the Taliban are pragmatic enough not to do very much to those minorities, Iran is unlikely to be a source of trouble. And in any case, last time around, the Iranians worked with us in backing Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ahmad Shah Massoud's son now is a refugee in Tajikistan. The Panjshir Valley is in the hands of the Taliban government. There is no significant resistance. So in short, I don't think we have too many attractive options. We have an implacably negative situation on our northwest frontier at the very time when the Chinese dragon is breathing fire and brimstone across the Himalayas on our northern frontier. And in particular, their behavior across right up and down the LAC has manifested what happened with the incident in the Galwan Valley last June when 20 of our soldiers were killed, suggests that they are busy adjusting the LAC to suit their interests, and they will not hesitate to push their interests and put India in its place or rock India off balance whenever it suits them to do so. So this is a major challenge for Indian diplomacy in the months ahead, as well as for Indian security. I think Brahma will concur with me that we are not particularly well equipped to contemplate the prospect of military activity on two fronts, and certainly dealing with geopolitical hostility on two fronts is already going to be a fairly major challenge for us. I think on that sobering note, I might pause, Brahma, and I'm happy to come back with comments after we've heard from Claude and you. Thank you very much.
That was an excellent presentation, Shashi. Thank you very much. I think the fighting continues in the Panjshir Valley, so I don't think the resistance has been smothered fully. The Panjshir Valley has many sub-valleys, and I think both Ahmad Massoud and Amrullah Saleh are still in the Panjshir Valley. But obviously the odds are against them, and the Taliban have the Pakistani military assistance in their assault on the Panjshir Valley. But we can come back to that later. But let me turn to Claude now. Claude, it's your turn. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Let me follow up on what Shashi was mentioning. And first of all, let me say that I am delighted to be joining this session. And at the same time, I'm humbled by the fact that I am sharing the podium with two very bright analytical minds, yourself, Brahma, and of course, Shashi. So I will try to be up to the challenge. Number one, as I will concur with Shashi, this is a major strategic setback for India. Not only India is back to square one in Afghanistan after all the investment it made over the last 20 years, it is now back with a regime which, despite the fact that they say that they would like to have good relations with India, for the moment doesn't show many signs that they have in a way changed their mindset and their behavior for what it was before the American invasion. And it means that the terrorist threat, by definition, becomes a looming factor. In fact, let us say that to some extent, the jihadist threat has increased because now the jihadists has a very strong rallying narrative. Think about it. They have defeated one major superpower at the time, which was the Soviet Union. Then now they have not only defeated another superpower of the United States, but we have seen the kind of very humiliating, chaotic scenes of the last American soldiers living in a kind of shameful situation, abandoning the people who had worked with them, and even some American citizens on the ground. So even though some observers say that the Taliban regime might be now hesitant to harbor terrorists on their soil because they would be afraid of American retaliation, it remains to be seen if let us put it that way, the DNA of the regime, of the Taliban, will not prevail. And after a period of, let's say, quietness, we will not see a resurgence of many terrorist groups trying their hand to make some victories, either in the region, starting with India, of course, or outside the region, because many of these Taliban consider that they have a revenge to exact from the Western world. So this is point number one. So the situation for India on the terrorist front, on the relationship with a major strategic country for India, Afghanistan, has become very, very bad. Point number two, and I concur with Shashi, the big winners in that are China and Pakistan, despite the fact that we say that, of course, we have the Taliban Pakistan who are in Afghanistan, which might try to do something against Pakistan, but we know at the same time the ISI, the Pakistani ISI, will keep and have some very strong hand and influence with the Taliban regime in Pakistan. But in addition to the gains that Shashi has outlined for China, there is the rare earth opportunities for China to increase its quasi-monopoly it has on these strategic elements and other minerals that Afghanistan has. There is another aspect that the Afghanistan role and influence that China is gaining, and as you mentioned yourself, they were very clever to already prepare the ground way before the Taliban entered Kabul. What we see is that this will create major opportunities for China beyond Afghanistan to expand its role and influence all over Central Asia. And so India sees its two major adversaries or challengers, Pakistan and China, consolidating their situation, and to some extent, not only consolidating their situation where they are with their increased grip on Afghanistan, but even consolidating their relationship through the common victory or the common advantage gained in Afghanistan. But for me, there is a third point, which is very important and on which I hope Indian strategists are thinking deeply. It is the lessons to be drawn about the US. I think we have seen, and I will not speak only about Afghanistan, that this US administration is just a new version of America First under new clauses. We have seen that for this administration, in fact, they speak a lot. You have all the sanctimonious blah, blah about looking for partners. This administration is not looking for partners. They are looking for agents to their strategy of creating a united front in their Cold War, or even more than Cold War, against China. And who are these agents? These are middle power countries like Australia, like the UK, like India. And we see that when the time comes, when the rubber hit the road, the US could not care less about the interest of this adjunct element in its strategy. Maybe there are elements that I ignore, but India was kept completely out of the Doha talk with the Taliban during the Trump administration. The Biden administration that says that the withdrawal from Afghanistan will allow it to focus more on the China threat, quote unquote. But what about the setback and the weakening of Indian position toward China because of what happened and the way it happened in Kabul? What about the implications for India about AUKUS, the new defense alliance between the US, the UK, and Australia? And when you look about the Quad, the US has defense treaties with Japan and Australia. When you look at AUKUS, the US is a NATO ally of the UK and has a defense treaty with Australia. And when you look at these two things, where does India stand in all that? Completely isolated, completely isolated. And so the question that this creates, and we have seen the way America decides when it considers that its interests are at stake, when we see that this administration is the most protectionist US administration in the last 30 or 40 years, is the questions that India strategists should think about. Of course, they need the alliance with the US, but how far can India go in aligning itself with the US, given that what we are seeing is, again, as I said, an America first mindset and strategy under new clothes and the new rhetoric?
Well, Claude, thank you very much for raising those very important points. Your clarity was outstanding, and I think you hit the right issues. Those issues need to be debated more widely in India. And the paradox is that at a time when the abject US capitulation to the Taliban in Afghanistan has compounded, if not compromised, India's security interests, at that very time, the Indian Prime Minister is now in Washington seeking to build an expanded partnership with the US. So you raise a fundamental question as to how far India should go in building a closer strategic relationship with Washington. But I will throw this open to the wider discussion, and there are already some questions from the audience. There is a question that I think everybody is asking is, why is the world silent to the atrocities that the Taliban are committing in Afghanistan? They are executing people. Taliban death squads are going door to door, looking for those who assisted the previous government. They are detaining and executing them, often executing them on the spot. We've seen videos of such executions. And yet, isn't it ironical that amid all this talk about human rights, the world is silent, especially the Western powers? How do you explain this? Let me ask Claude and then ask Shashi, both. Why don't you go first, Claude, and then Shashi immediately after that?
I think you are raising a very good point, because what we see is the incredible in the way in which the Western world look at human rights, being very scrutiny-minded when it comes to certain countries about human rights, and looking the other side when it comes to other countries. I think the silence that we see at the moment is a reflection of the helplessness that we are, given the fact that the way the withdrawal has happened has, in a way, denied Western countries which have the ability to act, has denied them any lever, any capability of pressure against this regime. And as you mentioned yourself, let us not forget, these people have a very special mindset. To some extent, they are fanatics. They are fanatics. Even if you do sanctions against them, I don't think it will make them change their mindset or their behavior. It will be the people who will suffer, and the people will suffer, and to prevent them to revolt, the repression and the iron grip of the regime on the people, the terror will just increase. So I think we have created a situation where the helplessness that we have created in the Western world by the way things happened now in a way forces to be just helpless spectators. And this is why, for instance, you may remember the former defense minister of the UK being in tears because he knows, they know, the NATO allies knew the consequences of the way the American withdrew, the Biden administration withdrew. And this is something which is very worrisome because Biden was told about the implication of the way he wanted to withdraw by his advisors. He could not care less. And his point when he said that he would not risk the lives of American soldiers, by the way, there were no lives being at risk because there had been no American casualties for almost 2 years. He would not risk the lives for the status of Afghan women, tells a lot about the reality between the rhetoric of the Biden administration and human rights and so on and so forth, and the reality of their action.
Yeah,
Shashi, go ahead.
No, I was just going to concur with Claude fairly briefly that I think the silence of Western governments is essentially about the fact that if they get too loud, the immediate question will follow what you're going to do about it. And not only are they not intending to do anything further about changing the situation that the world sees in Afghanistan, they don't want to be reminded of their transcendent failure the last time they tried. So, when you are not in a position to go in and redress a wrong, how does it help you as a government to declaim against that wrong very much? You try and avert your gaze. The public opinion, social media, mainstream media, they're all making the noise. It's not that there is total silence. We all know about all that's going on because there is reporting from them. But governments are relatively silent because, frankly, the situation in Afghanistan is a reminder of their impotence, their inability to do anything to redress the situation. If I may add a brief comment on what Claude said in his first set of remarks, not just on this one, and that is about the question of the Quad and the AUKUS, and now the question of what the significant options are for India vis-a-vis the US. I mean, I think that really our relationship with the US has much more to do, I mean, in this particular context, we have a long history, I'm not going into all that, but in the present context has to do with the fact that the US appears very clearly to have concluded that China is a major global strategic adversary that must be resisted. They're trying to accumulate more pawns on the chessboard and more other pieces on the chessboard to prevent the Chinese coming very farther down the path that they seem to be heading. We ourselves have been at the receiving end of Chinese misbehavior on our own territory, on our own borders, and therefore we find there is a common cause, a common interest. The Chinese want to stop the Chinese, we want to stop the Chinese, therefore can we be friendly with America? I don't think there's anything more profound than that. There are obvious limitations to that. The Quad has clearly been conceived as an Indo-Pacific partnership, and the Indo-Pacific is a body of water. It's a maritime focus. Whereas for us, while the maritime area is certainly valuable, and indeed if the Quad can be leveraged to help us increase our clout in the Indian Ocean and so on, great. But our principal direct challenge is actually a land-based challenge, and that is the challenge we face across the line of actual control in the Himalayas. And for the land-based challenge, we cannot count on any of the three members of the Quad to help us. Perhaps at best, we may get some intelligence cooperation. Might, if we wanted, get weapons, though that's not a big concern from the Americans. But the Australians and the Japanese are irrelevant to our land frontier with China, and the Americans are near irrelevant. We've already seen the limitations of how far the Americans would be prepared to go to help in situations far away from home. Certainly an America that has been sobered by the recent experience in Afghanistan and also sobered by Syria, Libya, and Iraq is not going to be particularly inclined to get directly engaged in a new India-China front in the Himalayas. I think we should have no illusions about that. I believe we don't. I think if I were to read the tea leaves in New Delhi carefully, I would say that the government of India is being particularly wary. You may have already seen the statements, Claude, yesterday, distancing India from the AU-US discussion, essentially saying we have nothing to do with it, it has nothing to do with us. And I think the reason for that, very simply, is precisely that India has even seen the Quad much more as a shield than as a sword. I think we are shoring up our defenses against possible future Chinese encroachment rather than seeking to be part of a proactive strategy allied with the US to curb the Chinese. Now, that's my view. Others may have a different take on the matter, but for the moment, that's where I believe New Delhi is. Rama.
Well, thank you, Shashi. We have run out of time. There are a number of questions, including a good question on Pakistan. After all, behind the Taliban is Pakistan. It's Pakistan that has really won in Afghanistan with its proxy. There's also a question about the impact on American credibility and American standing in the world. The larger questions about Indian strategy, but we don't have time. In fact, it's already it's 4:39, so I don't think I can afford to ask either Claude or Shashi to say anything because we'll go over time. So let me thank both Shashi and Claude for making excellent presentations and excellent points. I conclude the session and hand over to Mr. Kirloskar.
Oh.